Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, middle of the week, after work. You're all heroes to me. I'm so glad you're here. And if you're joining us via recording, I am so glad that you are here too to talk about one of my very most favorite things, and probably the thing that I am most excited about right now, because this issue of vocabulary instruction has been the pebble in my shoe for as long as I've been teaching. And this is probably the very first thing that in my first or second year of teaching, I identified as a big problem. I knew it wasn't working, what I was doing. And it was the very first thing that as a teacher, I really started to investigate sort of in terms of research, finding out, okay, what can I try? What can I experiment with? What can I fix to make this better? So before we get going, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that journey, but some of you who are already logged in here will notice I'm logged in twice. It's a little bit creepy, but I have my phone so I can monitor the chat. Thank you for participating, Sheila and Kristen. Thank you for saying hi. But please, at any time, feel free to drop a comment in the chat. I'm going to have a couple ways for you to participate this evening. But if you have a question, put it in the chat. I'll pause periodically, and I'll definitely pause at the end to answer questions. So, language field guides, how did I get here? Well, I truly believe I've tried everything there was to try in vocabulary instruction. When I started teaching, I taught at a large school that did vocabulary workbooks. Every child had the workbook for his or her grade level, and we moved through one unit a week, and it was like 20 words. They would define them. They would move through a series of activities like matching, fill in the blank, working with analogies. And then at the end of the week, we would do a quiz. And that's what I instantly knew was not working. Even the kids who could perform well on that quiz were not really learning anything. Nothing was sticking. They were just sort of performing and moving on. So I started researching what else there was to find out there in vocabulary instruction. And I started to read a lot of professional texts, particularly, I think by Pam Allen. And suddenly I found ways to actually make kids think about words and engage with words. But guess what? It literally took me an entire 90-minute class period every week to move students through those activities and have those discussions that were really helping them think about words and learn words and own words. And y'all, that wasn't working either, because as rich as the learning was, I saw my students 3 times a week. I couldn't give up 1/3 of my instructional time for vocabulary instruction. So then I spent many years, most of my years, really not doing anything at all. When we were reading a whole class text, occasionally we would pause and talk about a word. That was it. I was kind of subscribing to that osmosis theory, oh, well, and you've probably heard this. If they're doing enough independent reading, then they're just going to naturally soak in all of those words, which I would love to believe. I actually would like to believe that. However, if we lived in a world where children, looked up every unfamiliar word and really sat with it and tossed it around their brain and thought about it, that would be one thing, but that is not the world we live in. So about 5 years ago, I was like, you know what? It's enough. Like, all of this is not great. I'm going to figure out how to fix this. And that is when I started developing these field guides with my students. I developed them with a group of kids. I gave them some parameters. I said, I want it to do this, 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 and this. And they helped me come up with ways that we could do it. And I've been tweaking it ever since. So this is the first webinar I've ever done on this topic, but it really is like my little heart baby right now. And I hope that you find it exciting and useful and helpful in your classroom as well. Sorry, I'm trying to fiddle with this until you can see me. So tonight I've made you a hyperdoc of some resources. So you can head to this bit.ly address to get them. It's bit.ly/field guide resources. And let me show you what is there. So when you head there, There are links to the instructions that I give my students for choice word field guides. And there are instructions for bigger kids and smaller kids. I've done this with students as young as 3rd grade and as old as 12th grade AP IB students. And the instructions are pretty similar. You'll notice when you look at them, I change the resources for younger students. I change some of the things that they are looking for as they are exploring, but the fundamentals are pretty much the same. And then down here, what you'll find is sort of the onboarding process that you and I are going to walk through tonight. I could talk about this for days, days and days. Today, we're just going to think about how do you get kids started? How do you go from never doing field guides at all to getting students to the place where they can do a pretty good job on it? So we're just talking about that very, very, very beginning part today. So you'll see up here in this row, this is sort of the I go, we go, you go process that we go through in the very, very first days of introducing field guide work. And then these bottom 2 rows are kind of a series of mini lessons that you might realize your students need. These are things you might teach over the course of the next few weeks. Once kids are practicing in their first field guides, these are the mini lessons that are going to make them better. And this is what we are walking through together tonight. So you have this resource available to you. All right, so what's a field guide? You probably know, right? Like we've all seen them, these nature field guides, guides to like the wildflowers of this national park or birds of North America, or these incredible illustrated ones. These are done by an artist in Northern California, I believe, and she makes these and they actually put them on like signs in state parks and national parks. But all in all, field guides are tools, right? They are resources. They're illustrated guidebooks that identify the features of objects out in the natural world. So here is my field guide entry. So I'm going to move our faces again. My field guide entry for field guide entries. So a field guide happens out in nature, and it's something that you might create yourself. It's something that people sometimes, they have one in their pocket. And when they see a new bird, they'll sketch the bird and they'll be like, okay, I saw it in this kind of tree. It was this kind of weather. I was in this location. But a language field guide takes that same idea and plays with it. A language field guide is a tool for recording the discoveries that we make about language out in nature and out in the wild. And this is my sort of field guide entry about field guide entries. And that's what we're talking about today. Now, my personal field guide that I model for the students, you can see it happens in my notebook. A lot of the examples you're going to see from students this evening are happening in Jamboard this year because I've eliminated all of the paper in my classroom because of this weird year. Typically, my students are doing it on paper too in a notebook that we dedicate just for this purpose. They have a separate field guide notebook, but it doesn't matter where they do it. There's no magical tool about that. It's just important that there's a place, just like a writer's notebook. There's a place where they are gathering all of the words that they are exploring and discovering out in the world, and a place where they're keeping all of their discoveries about it. So tonight we're talking about this onboarding process, and you might be wondering, how long is this going to take? How long do I need to spend onboarding? And the truth is 2 things. The truth is it'll take a couple days to get to the point where kids can start making a field guide themselves. But it also takes all year long, right? For them to refine that process, for you to continue to teach into their field guides and for them to get better and better. And I know it is the middle of April, but I think this is actually the ideal time of year to try something new. Because in August and September, when we're getting back to school, we are overwhelmed. We're overwhelmed with faculty meetings and new procedures, and goodness knows this year had lots of those, both faculty meetings and new procedures. We're overwhelmed with new students, and we're trying to onboard students to everything, right? We're trying to teach them every routine. This is a time of year when students are in the routines you've already taught them, and it's a really good time for you to be able to test out something new, to say like, I'm just going to low key play around with this for a little bit and see how it works and make plans to use it full time in the fall. So please don't be dissuaded from starting this now. You don't need to wait until the fall. You don't need to wait until, the first day of school to start to try this. When I started developing this with my students 5 years ago, it was actually this time of year. It was like March and April when I had just had it with what we were doing for vocabulary instruction or not doing for vocabulary instruction. And I said, okay, it's the end of the year. We're going to try something new. We're going to try to find a tool that will help us. So let me show you just a little bit about this onboarding. So this is Emery, and Emery is a 7th grader in my class this year. And this is her field guide from August. This was her very first choice word field guide. And here's some things I want you to notice. You'll see that she has definitions for her word prospect, but she just straight up copied and pasted those from the dictionary, which I'm always trying to get kids away from. She has an example from a professional source, which is great. She has some thoughts about the word, but there's not a lot here, right? And this is where she started. And Emery is probably, an average student for me. She's a good student, but, she's not the superstar of her class. This is Emery's most recent field guide from last week for the word archetype. So obviously, you notice, right? So many more things. You can see that she has this graph, which we'll talk about the use over time, and she's thought about why it was used over time. She's thought about lots of different kinds of examples and what those examples might be showing her. You can see just visually, this is much more deep and rich with thought than where she started at the beginning of the year. And this is what the onboarding process looks like. When you start after those first few days, you're probably going to get something that looks like this. And that's a good starting place. And then as you take those mini lessons, those onboarding mini lessons that we're going to talk about tonight, and work through them over time, right? The work grows and it deepens and it becomes more nuanced. So you can get going this week. It just takes time and practice and repetition and talking about our field guides to continue to deepen and enrich them. Here's one from last year that was in our paper notebooks on the word blasé. This student actually grew to the point where she was filling 2 notebook pages for her word as she turned it over in her head and thought about it in different ways. So introducing students to field guide through inquiry. This is what I do on the very first few days. I give students some actual field guides from the library. I get mine from the public library. You could even go on Amazon and take some screenshots of pages of field guides and share them with students digitally. And in the real non-COVID world, we get into groups and we rotate the different field guides through different groups. And students might see a field guide for birds, a field guide for rocks, a field guide for trees, a field guide for wildflowers, and a field guide for fish. And over the course of a class period, I ask students to jot down the different types of information that are included in a field guide. When we start this, maybe 1 or 2 students even knows what a field guide is. A few of them have ever held one or touched them. And sure, it would be a lot faster to just tell them, hey, y'all, a field guide is a book that's an illustrated guidebook to objects in the natural world. But I think for students to really shift their paradigms about vocabulary instruction, to really get into a frame of mind that this is about something other than memorizing words and definitions and just rote copying them down. It's important for them to understand the metaphor of the field guide, that this is something that explorers, that naturalists create to record their discoveries and then make those discoveries available for other people. It's a resource that they go back to time and time and time again, and they keep in their backpack. And every time they go hiking, they carry that field guide with them, right? It's a really different mindset from vocabulary work that we are all used to. So students will come up with a big list. We share out as a group what are all the different types of information we might find in a field guide. And then I ask them to translate it. I ask them, okay, how could we use this type of information, but make it about words instead of about birds, rocks, trees? So here's just one example of what we came up with. For instance, if a nature field guide shares a picture of the species, then in a word field guide, a field guide that's about language, we might include images and visuals that we associate with that word. If a nature field guide describes where a species is found in the wild, then we might think about where these words are found in the wild, in what contexts and what situations might we run into these words, and what situations might we use these words. Maybe what's their connotation versus their denotation. When we look in a nature field guide and it talks about the origin of that species, like these birds originally hail from the mid-Atlantic. When it comes to words, we might think about the origins of the words, the morphology, the etymology, the different little recognizable word parts that come together to build that word. When we think about the sound, then in a word field guide, we might think about the pronunciation. And this seems silly, I know, but how many times have you, as an adult, seen a word, been able to even recognize the word and basically know its meaning, but you're not totally sure how to pronounce it, right? This happens to our students all the time. They don't own a word until they can use that word, and that's both in writing and out loud. So pronunciation is absolutely something we put in our field guide. If a nature field guide describes common behaviors of that species, how this bird acts in the wild, then we might think about how our word acts in the wild, common contexts. We might think about words it goes with, right? Words you often see this word nearby. If it identifies the species' broader family, then we might think about the broader word family, including synonyms and antonyms and fuzzy nyms and related words, alternate forms of the word. And then if a nature field guide gives locations where we could go out and find this species, and we go out and find our word. We include where we find this word in sentences from professionals, from people in our lives. If we heard it in a Billie Eilish song, we put that in our field guide too. And this is just a sampling. We go on and on and on and draw out this metaphor for kids because it changes the way we think about the work that we are about to do. And suddenly, when I ask students, what word are you exploring this week? And what have you discovered about it? That rings a bell, and that feels really different, and it means something different than, did you copy down the part of speech and the definition? So this is what we're going to talk about tonight, is that when we teach students how to create excellent field guides, what we're actually teaching are 3 skills. We're teaching them how to be curious about words and what that actually looks like. We're teaching them how to research words, and we're teaching them how to build connections between words. So all of the mini lessons that I listed for you on that onboarding document, they fall into one of these 3 categories, and that's how we're going to move through them this evening. Here are the links again to the instructions. These are on your onboarding docs, so you can go get them. And choice word field guides are just one type of field guide that we work with, but this is where we always start, and this is where we always return. So this is where we're starting together tonight. I'm really sorry about the picture situation. I can't get it to show me unless I show everybody. So I'm sorry. Okay, so language field guides, as in most things, modeling is the very, very best instruction, right? In so many of these lessons, you're going to hear me say, and then I just go and I do it and I model it out loud for my students. So what I do in one of the very early days is I model a field guide. And you and I are going to kind of compress this timeline together tonight. But when I model a field guide, I ask students the very first day to do nothing but watch my moves. Okay. I want them to watch what I'm doing. I want them to listen to what I'm thinking because I'm thinking aloud. And I ask them to make a list in their notebook of the moves they see me make, the thinking moves they see me make, the research moves they see me make. So I'm not going to make a whole field guide for you tonight, but I am going to start one. And I would like you to do the same. So if you want to put it in chat, that would be awesome. But as I begin, I want you to sort of think about what are the thinking moves I'm making in order to make a field guide, and what are the research moves I'm making. So I'm going to make my field guide in Jamboard because that's where my students have been working this year. I'm going to have to move you again. There we go. And I have chosen the word couch. And I chose this word because I was actually really curious about it. Some people call that thing that you sit on in your family room a couch, and other people call it a sofa. And I don't really know the difference. So this is how I came to this word. It was just a word that I've always been like, I wonder what that actually really means. I also happen to know that this word has a different meaning, and I want to research that too. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my favorite dictionary, which is vocabulary.com. And I am going to look up my word couch. And anytime you want to chat the moves you see me making, you go right ahead. All right, so I see a couch is a sofa. Okay, that's not helpful, but now I know. An upholstered piece of furniture that seats more than one person. It's nice to have a couch that's big enough for your whole family to sit on while you watch TV. Okay, I like to start with my definition. So it's an upholstered seat for more than one person, or a narrow bed on which a patient lies during a psychiatric or psychoanalytic treatment, or a flat coat of paint used by artists as a primer. I did not know that one at all. And this is what I was thinking of. Sometimes it's a verb and it means to put something into a particular style or language. All right, so I need to go back to my field guide and I need to get some of that down, and I need to get it down in my own words because that's how I'm going to remember it. So when it's a noun, I'm trying to remember what I read because that's going to help me put it in my own words. When it's a noun, it's a piece of upholstered furniture, or a psychiatric bed, or a coat of primer. Okay, I really want to think in a minute about how those things go together because they feel like they don't go together at all. And then I also read that it can be a verb, and it means to put something into a particular style or format. So I am going to think about those things. Okay, now let me see what else I can discover about this word that I didn't know. I'm going to go back up here because this usually gives me some other interesting extra information. The word couch comes from the French word coucher, meaning to lie down. All right, so that makes some sense to me. So from French, coucher, which means to lie down. And that actually like totally goes with the upholstered furniture and the psychiatric bed kind of definitions, right? Because you're lying down on that bed at the therapist's office. We often lie down on our sofas and watch TV. And maybe even with the coat of primer, you're like putting down, lying down that primer level so you can add on to it. Let's see. Some types of couches are indeed meant for lying down. Psychiatrist couch. And language to couch is to phrase your words in a certain manner. So that's what we were talking about, like putting it in a particular style. Okay, I want to hop over here for a minute and look at the usage examples. And I want to see, it's really interesting when I look at these four, right? The first four examples that come up are all from novels, which is surprising. Sitting on a couch, something hanging over a couch, into her eyes couched beneath those were severe eyebrows. And I wonder if I went to news. Yep, there are plenty of news too. So I could search through these different kinds of sources. And if I were doing this for real, I would spend some time copying and pasting and putting some professional examples that interest me into my field guide so I could go back and think about them later and think about the patterns that these show me. If I learn anything about how to use this word by looking at these professional examples. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to do that right now. I am going to take you to my other favorite source, etymonline.com. This is an etymology dictionary. And this is going to tell me more about my word and where it came from. Okay, let's see if they have the noun version. Okay, so they have separate versions for the noun and the verb. I've been thinking about the noun. So it's from the mid 14th century. That's crazy because that is old, right? Mid 14th century. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, I might go back and think about that sometime and think about what do I know about the mid 14th century that could explain where this word came from. We learned about the French already. I saw the voulez-vous coucher avec moi, Kristen, over there in chat. Okay, here we go. Traditionally, a couch has the head end only raised and only half a back, but a sofa has both ends raised. And a settee is like a sofa, but without arms. And an ottoman has none of those things. And a divan goes against a wall. Okay. This was actually more information than I really wanted about this. But I did want to get into this, right? I said that was one of the things I wanted to investigate. So couch versus sofa. Traditionally, a couch has one end raised and half a back, while a sofa has both ends raised and a full back. And therefore, I guess what I have in my family room is actually a sofa by the traditional definition. Now, if we were really in class, y'all, I might do this for a whole class period. I only have 50-minute class periods. And I keep going and I keep going and I keep going. And I look through all of the resources that I share with them on those instructions. And I think aloud the whole time. And they're making a list the whole time. Because one of the things I really want them to see right from the get-go, from the first time I model this for them, is that I can take even a really banal word like couch, a word that I'm familiar with already. It's not a crazy, weird word. It's not a word I don't know at all. And yet I can make a lot of discoveries about it, right? It doesn't matter what the word is. If we are word explorers with our field guides, we can make discoveries. So here's what I want you to do, just really quickly. I want you to stick with my word couch, or you could branch out to sofa. And I'd like you to try one of these three resources. These are my top three: vocabulary.com, mw.com, and etymonline.com. And I'm just going to give us like 3 or 4 minutes for you to choose one of those sites, type in the word couch, and I want you to see if you click around enough, can you make a discovery about this word? Something that makes you say, I didn't know that. Or, interesting. Okay. I'm going to mute me for a few minutes, and whatever you discover, I want you to type into the chat and share with us. And then I'll answer your question that I just saw pop up when we get back, okay? About 3 or 4 minutes. Type your discoveries into the chat. All right, we have one discovery coming in the chat. About 2 more minutes. Something you didn't know, something that you find interesting about this word that could qualify as a discovery. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start talking. Please continue to put discoveries in chat because look what's happening. For people who are listening to this as a recording, I'm going to kind of narrate for you. But we have the first thing that someone discovered is couch potato was first recorded in 1979. We're going to talk in a couple minutes about connecting words to history, but it would be really interesting to think about what was happening in 1979 that made couch potato suddenly appear. We're thinking about connotation with Meredith. She said, I always thought a sofa was a little bit fancier and more posh. Now this is, of course, this is, sometimes this leads us outside of those prescribed resources, which are just starting places for students to make discoveries. But when I Googled couch versus sofa, I went to this article on Elle Decor. Is the couch actually more laid back than a sofa? Possibly. So you can find other places that kind of work on that connotation, but even just recording your connotation or the student's connotation is valuable. Like I think of a couch as something that's like, like the kind of flattened, right? Because all the stuffing has been flattened because so many kids have been sitting on it. But a sofa is something we put in the nice room that you don't sit on. Someone said, my grandmother always called her couch a Davenport. I looked it up and found that one of the meanings was a large upholstered sofa, often convertible into a bed. And then Kristen's Kristen's grandmother called hers a Davenport too. And both grandmothers were German. We just made that connection. So wouldn't that be an amazing thing for a student to put into his or her field guide, right? That like, oh, I associate this with my grandmother and she actually had this other word for it. And I wonder what that word means, because this is the curiosity. We're going down these rabbit trails, but they're good ones because they're leading us to make more meaning. The word couch is older than the word sofa. Kristen was thinking about the connection between lying down and the verb use is that when you lie down, you're lying hidden. When you phrase your words or you couch your words, you have like a hidden or an implicit meaning. How interesting is that? She's kind of connecting those dots to make the noun definition and the verb definition make sense together. Synonyms like Davenport have me wondering where the word came from. How are these related? A couch can also be an animal den, and animals are hidden within a den. Also, thinking about things that are hidden in couches, right? There's probably a pound of Cheerios hidden in my couch cushions right now. So all of these things. And you see how even with Davenport and Chesterfield sound very posh types of sofas or types of couches. You can see how even with a word that does not seem that exciting, we can make discoveries. We can be curious about it. We can ask questions about it. We can go research and find information about it, and then we can build on our connections. And this is the exact kind of thing that we want to model for our students in those first days. After we've said, okay, we're going to make field guides. Here's what a field guide is. How can we make a word field guide? Okay, now I'm going to make a word field guide. Watch what I do, because this is the kind of thinking that you are going to do. All right, now that it's 7:37, I want to walk you through just quickly some of these introductory mini lessons. Now, this is not prescriptive, the mini lessons that I've left for you on the onboarding doc that I'm going to talk about tonight. They don't have to go in a certain order. You don't have to teach them all if you find that your students don't need them. But these are the lessons that I found my students need early on to help them take it from that sort of August sparse field guide that was just kind of copy and paste to the April field guide that has a lot of thinking in it, thinking that's going to be sticky and is going to help Emory remember those words. So these are options. You know your kids, you know what they need. But I think that we also often think like it's a dictionary. How could you not know how to use a dictionary? But they don't. So a lot of these things are lessons that I've stumbled on over time because I assumed students had knowledge that they didn't have. So early on, when we're thinking about teaching curiosity, one of the things that we talk about is how do you choose a good word to explore? We're talking about choice word field guides tonight. Well, how do you choose that word? So I tell students that the most important thing about choosing a word is that it has to be a word you actually encounter. I have had lots of students over the years Google longest word in the English language, weird words in the English language, and they come up with stuff, but they're not words that they're actually encountering in real life. And thus all of this work of discovery that they're putting into it doesn't really come to much for them because they're probably never going to encounter that word again in real life. So we talk about, is this a word you've actually encountered? Have you heard it? Have you seen it? Is it in a song that you've listened to? Is it something that your grandmother always says to you, but you don't know what it means, like a Davenport, okay? So a great way to choose a choice word, it could be a word that you encounter that you totally are unfamiliar with. And that's how we tend to think about this work, right? Students would choose words they didn't know in their reading. And that's a great place to choose a word. But it could also be a word with which you're familiar, but you couldn't actually give a definition, or a word you love and you just want to know more about, or a word you're curious about, like couch, and just want to know more about. It could be a word that you suspect means something else too. And I think this happens for our kids a lot. They're like, I think it means this, but I've heard it in other ways, and I don't know if it means something else, and I don't know if it means what I think it means. This would be a good word for me to explore. As a last case scenario as like a last stop before they just Google weird words in the English language. I tell them, if you absolutely cannot come up with a word to explore that you're curious about, then vocabulary.com has PSAT and SAT words, or the New York Times has a word of the day archive. Go to one of those places if you absolutely cannot come up with a word, but don't just Google strange words, because you're going to do a lot of work that's not useful to you. So in my class, when kids are finding choice words, one of the ways that we do this is by just making an anchor chart of possibilities. This is an anchor chart of possibilities from articles of the week. That year I was doing Kelly Gallagher's article of the week routine. And as students found words in those articles that they were like, oh, that would make a good field guide, they would just put a Post-it on our anchor chart. And then later, when it was time to do another choice word field guide, you could go take a Post-it and that could be your word. You'll see Olivia here kind of underneath my face, working on a phrase that she was curious about. Bless you. She wanted to know where that came from. So instead of just a single word, she investigated a phrase. They love to do this. They love to investigate slang, which sometimes leads us into scary places, but that's okay because they're chasing their curiosities, right? Like that's what we want. Another thing that they do from time to time is they'll investigate invented words. So this was done last year by one of my students, Gretchen, and her family has a word, flartnut, and its definition is a made up word. So her mom might say like, oh, what are you talking about, Gretchen? That doesn't make any sense. That's just a flartnut. It's kind of a made up word. You're talking nonsense. And so she went through all the process, right? What's the part of speech? What is an image I would associate with this? What are the little parts I could break it down into? And she thought it came from flarp and nut. Those were the word parts. She gave sample sentences. So once students really get into this routine, I let them sort of branch out and be creative. And if they say, hey, Ms. Odell, can I do this phrase that like my grandmother says all the time, but I don't know where it comes from? And then I'm like, yes, you can do that. Or can I do this word that my family made up? And it doesn't really mean anything, but we use it all the time. Absolutely. Another way that we can develop curiosity about words for our students is just talking to them about the questions that we ask of words when we are investigating them. I call this question flooding our word. So when students are working on their field guides, you might have them spend some time jotting down the questions that they ask inside their heads as they investigate that word. Here are some of the questions that I've developed with kids, questions that they're asking. When you get this recording, you can take a screenshot here and save all of these questions. But all of these questions came from kids. These are the things that are happening inside their brains as they are looking for new discoveries about a word. I think that initially, because of the way that we've traditionally taught vocabulary, students think that the only question is, what does it mean, right? What's a part of speech? What's the definition? But if we can show them, and we do this through our modeling, we do this by asking students to think about, metacognitively, what are the questions happening inside your brain as you do this activity? But we show them how one question leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. And this flood of questions is actually how we explore the word. So giving them some questions to ask as they investigate, coming up with a class list of questions we ask about words as we're exploring them, asking students to do this on their own metacognitively, and then see which questions did you ask? Which questions have you not asked about your words yet? So that when you try to do a field guide next time, what are some new questions you can add to ask about your word? Early on, put my face back on there. Early on, when we're teaching word research, there are a number of lessons that I teach that feel really self-explanatory, and I have found are not. Researchers follow their questions and search for what they don't know. They expect to be surprised, just like we expected to be surprised about the word couch. Like, what can we find? What can we discover? And so we want to teach students to go into this word research with this mindset, right? It's very different than go to the dictionary, find the definition, to say, can you research this word? Can you search for what you don't already know? Even if it's a word you think you know, what don't you know about this word yet that you could be surprised by? So what early, I teach what can we learn from the dictionary. Now, my two favorites are vocabulary.com and MW, it's Merriam-Webster. But I teach students, to look for multiple definitions and multiple parts of speech. So often, especially when they're scrolling online, they scroll down to the first thing that looks like a definition. That's what they copy and they X out, right? We actually have to show them, look, if you keep scrolling, there are actually two different parts of speech and four very different definitions for couch. You have to look for all of that. It's also important in dictionaries online to show them that there is so much more than just the definition, right? We got information about etymology and morphology. We got sentences from professionals organized by category. If you kept clicking around, there was information about word frequency and how often you'll encounter this word in English writing. And then, we also have to show them all of the things that a dictionary has to offer. And again, we do this by modeling. We do this by pulling it up and walking them through and showing it. We also need to teach them how to synthesize and paraphrase definitions. I was going to walk through this with you, but for the sake of time, I was going to use the word magazine, because magazine is another great everyday word that you can actually model with. Because everyone's going to say, oh, I totally know what a magazine is. It has a lot of different definitions. And then there's like the publication magazine and then the weapons definition of magazine. But when we are looking at all of those definitions and we're trying to put it into our field guide and put it into our own words, we want to think first about synthesis. Which of these definitions go together? And we did this with couch, right? We thought about like, oh, these kind of go together in this way. How can they be combined? And then which part of the definition are really, truly, totally separate and they need to be dealt with separately? I give them this protocol for paraphrasing. You probably do too, but read it, look away from it, and then write down in your own words what it is you remember. And then go back to the original definition and say, like, okay, did I catch all of these ideas? What did I miss? What do I need to go and add back in? I spend a lot of time on this because students, for months, will want to just copy and paste the definition, but that doesn't help them. And as you know, sometimes the dictionary definition is like just as confusing as not looking at a definition at all. The dictionary definition might be more confusing. So putting it in their own words, paraphrasing it, is absolutely essential. I also show them what thesaurus.com can tell them. In particular, we talk about this color coding that you see here, with like this red orange being the closest to the word that we searched, and then the yellow being sort of like the least related of the synonyms. And you can see we could choose the noun version and the verb version here. And look how interesting this is. You see Chesterfield and Davenport, by the way, friends, and Ottoman and Devon and Sete. But the first one that comes up is bed. Isn't that interesting? And we could put that into our field guide. We could say like the closest synonym according to thesaurus.com is bed. And that actually goes with that original French coucher, to lie down. And it makes me think that actually a couch isn't designed for, sitting upright and watching TV. It's actually designed for us to lie down prone on it to stretch out. It might be a good argument for a kid to like not share the sofa with his siblings, right? Or the couch. See, I use them synonymously. But kids don't know this about thesauruses. They usually would just come in on their own and copy down every single thing they see here and move on without thinking, why is bed the closest synonym? Why is resting place then the farthest away? Right? That's interesting and something to think about. And it's probably because it's not a piece of furniture, where like a lot of these are, actual pieces of furniture. So we can just do a quick little modeling lesson right before they get to work one day on their own choice word field guides and say, hey, let's look at a thesaurus together and think about how we can look for synonyms that really, really mean something, and we can think through that meaning. We definitely have to teach them how to use an etymology dictionary because it is hard. If y'all looked at Etym online a few minutes ago for Couch, it was not necessarily intuitive. So here's what I tell them about etymology dictionaries. You don't need to stress about understanding every single word that's in that entry. Some of it is very linguistic. Linguists understand that language. Relay people don't necessarily. Some important things to find are the words age. And what does that age tell you? Look for word parts, the roots, the prefixes. How can we put those together to make meaning? How does knowing those parts help us understand the word? And then follow those rabbit trails with the etymology. And Etym Online, you'll often, Couch actually, you'll come up with some hyperlinks, which will lead you to word parts, which will lead you to other origins, which give you new information. So in the etymology dictionary, following those rabbit trails is actually really helpful for getting deeper into the word, making more connections, and getting more information. All right, word connections, how we put these words together to make meaning. And these are the first lessons I teach for word connections. So first of all, professional examples. We find out how writers in the real world are using this word right now by looking at, for instance, MW or vocabulary.com. And then I ask students, when you've pulled a few professional examples, do you see any patterns? Do you notice any consistencies? For instance, when we were looking at Couch on vocabulary.com, I noted that the first 4 examples were all from novels, which was really interesting to me. That was a pattern that I saw. What can you infer about how to use this word by spending time with these examples? Oftentimes when we're looking at professional examples, we're noticing subjects, right? Like topics around which we might use this word, but we're also noticing words that go together, right? So when I use this word, it's almost always followed by of, or this word is almost always followed by an adjective. We start to notice how this word is used commonly, and we're getting that usage into our brains. This is also where if a student had encountered this word out in the wild, they'd heard it on a TV show, or I often get, I heard it on NPR in the car with my mom, or this is something my dad always says to me. This is where they would also put those examples, how they have heard this word being used out in the wild. So here is an example of that. This is Emery's archetype again. And she noticed that it was used in 2 sports articles that she found through vocabulary.com. And she thinks that this is interesting because, she didn't really realize that it could be used as a sports word. We were studying it in English because we were studying common character archetypes. That's why she chose this word. She just wanted to know more about it. And so here she has her examples, and then here she has her thinking about it. Like, oh, okay, this shows me that this can be used in sports as well as in literature or art or science. So another thing that we can teach students to do is to build connections by looking for their word in Google News. This is really fun. I'm actually going to show you this for a second. Again, I'm really sorry about moving my face all around the screen. You would think at this point of the year, I would be like really, really good at Zoom, but not always. So if you go to news.google.com, you can put your word in, couch. Okay. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to make note of the headlines. Artsy throw pillows to brighten up your couch. 12 most comfortable couches you can buy on Amazon. RV dwelling victim claims whiskey drinking man friend pushed her over the couch. Which brings up a good point that you never know what you're going to find on Google News. Dude, where's my couch? Virgil Ernest Couch. This looks like it's someone's name. Couch potatoes are twice as likely to die from COVID. Amazon's #1 best-selling couch on sale. All Forms spring sofa sale includes my favorite couch. Another obituary. A couch to 5K swim. Okay, so here's what I noticed, and this is what I would put in my field guide. I would say, even though couch has a lot of different definitions, and even though it can be used as a noun and a verb, when I look at it in the news, I see that in news articles, in the common parlance, right, it is used 99.9% of the time as that first noun definition, right? A place that you sit, a upholstered piece of furniture that goes in your living room. That really is the biggest way this word is used. And I know that that's true because I'm looking at these recent headlines as recent as 59 minutes ago, and it's telling me that. I'm looking for patterns. I also am going to put in my field guide, didn't know, that it is a last name, right? It's a name. I actually did know a girl named with the last name of Couch, but I might add that to my field guide as well. Meredith says that Merriam-Webster has a quote from 2021 about couch surfing, right? So we could think about that, like, oh, couch surfing. Well, what does that mean? And why would that be in a 2021 article? Well, what's going on in the world that would lead us to couch surfing? So this can be, it's kind of a twist on the professional examples, but a really fun, interesting, stimulating way to think about, like, how is this word being used? What do I notice? What are the situations and contexts in which I commonly find this word in headlines? What patterns do I see? And then, of course, pushing that even farther when you get down the road and kids have been doing this longer, to ask, why might that be? Do we have any theories about that? So here, the word was consumer, and this is Evie's, and she put down 3 titles. And she said, these articles reference like how much stuff Americans or Virginians, we're in Virginia, are buying, AKA consuming. So she noticed that, like, in these article titles, it all had to do with buying goods. And that was the pattern that she noticed, and trends in buying goods. The last connection that I teach early on is connecting words to history. My social studies colleague loves me for this. And that would be really fun for you to hook up with a social studies colleague and find out, like, what time periods they're teaching and how you might be able to connect it. But another site we can go to is books.google.com/ngrams. And this is what shows us usage over time. So in here, I can put my word couch. Oh, my word. Look at this, y'all. It shows me the usage over time. So I can see, we know because of Etym Online that it goes back to the 14th century. But as far as this goes, it's pretty steady for a while. It dips way down around like the 20s, 30s, 40s, like the Depression. And look at it now. Way, way, way up. So students love to either draw this in their notebooks when we're working on paper or just screenshot it and put it in. You saw that in some of my examples. But I tell them it's not enough just to talk about the trends. Then we have to think about why. So can you, in the chat, think about why? Looking at these trends, could you conjecture based on what you know about history, what you know about current events? Why do you think there's this dip around the Depression? Why do you think there's this spike when we get to like the 80s? HGTV, the rise of cable television, the rise of bingeable shows. maybe, right? Keep us on our couch longer. Any other theories? I'm watching the chat. The invention of the VCR. I love that. We could maybe attribute it to the invention of streaming. But like, yeah, once you got the VCR and you could watch older things and rewatch things, then maybe you spent more time on your couch in front of the TV. Maybe during the Depression, I can imagine that the Depression leading into World War II, it just wasn't a big concern, right? This is not something people would be writing about a lot. Being home more, streaming systems like Netflix, right? And especially this year, right? Working from home, people being home more. I also wonder if the dip in the past year or so has been because people say Netflix and chill instead of sit on the couch. That's a great theory, right? Maybe we've developed other language for that sitting on the couch and watching TV phenomenon. And now we use the word a little bit less because we have a different word. These are excellent theories. So that is what we then push kids to do. After they have seen the usage over time, we say, okay, well, let's think about it. What does it mean? What could it mean? What could we hypothesize? When did your word peak in popularity? What was happening around that time? Are there dips? What historical events or movements, or what do you know about history that might help explain this? There are also websites like onthisday.com, which tells you about historical events on a particular day or a particular decade, that even if they had no knowledge whatsoever, as like if you wanted to go back to the mid 14th century and research the invention of the word couch, right? You can get a list of simplified historical events that they could look at, that they would also help them come to some of these conclusions. And it's not necessarily important with this that they're totally right? Like our students are not professional historians. What's important is that this is making them think. It's making them think about the word in lots of different ways. It's like a kaleidoscope, right? And we just keep turning the kaleidoscope of that word so they're viewing it in different ways, because that's what's making the learning sticky. And this is what's not happening when they're just memorizing a list of 20 definitions, right? They're not thinking about that word, thinking about it with nuance, thinking about it in different ways. So we can look at this one with the word ether. Here was the usage over time. And this student conjectured that that kind of peak, or like when it was first sort of peaking in the 19th century, was a time when ether was considered a key part of physics. Another interesting thing we can see is that as ether was proved wrong, its usage decreased drastically. Okay. I don't actually know where the student came up with that information, but they were thinking about it. The word austere. So the word usage peaks around 1800 to 1820. During this time, a new style of art called neoclassicism was emerging. It was a very austere style of painting where lines and shapes mattered more than colors. These are seventh graders and eighth graders. Okay, so imagine what a high schooler could do with it. Imagine what an AP student could do with it, kind of like you guys over here in my chat as they unearthed layers and layers and layers of meaning and connected it to so much more history that they would have access to. Dissentient. I loved this one. I actually didn't know this word until this field guide. It peaked in 1861, and this was also during the Civil War. Isn't that interesting? And isn't it amazing how those things actually go together? So there were opposing sides and dissentients who were for or against slavery and states' rights. So these were just the introductory lessons to get you going. As I've said before, we use these in a lot of different ways throughout the year. I use them with literature. I use them with students' own writing, and maybe we'll talk about some of those down the road. But these are the essentials that kind of get kids to the starting line and then get them to sort of a full page of thinking. What you'll see in the instructions is what I ask, a full page of thinking. I know lots of teachers who have tried this and are having great success with it. I got this yesterday from Andrea, who said she was doing it with fifth graders, which I love, and that it leads to choice. And there's so much learning potential here. Here was another class they were all studying the same word, but they were studying from A Raisin in the Sun, because that was their whole class text at the time. And so they were studying essential words from A Raisin in the Sun. Ninth graders doing them. And this teacher, Christina, said that she really liked the connection between the exploration in a nature field guide and the exploration kids are expected to do in this kind of work, because it gives kids some freedom, which is the last thing that we would associate typically with vocabulary instruction the traditional way, right? Like freedom is not a word we would associate with that. But that freedom leads to engagement, right? Just like choice always, always, always does. And Stacy also, loved, this was right when she started it. Her first field guides were trickling in and she said they were incredible. And I want you to be able to experience that as well. I see your questions and I'm definitely going to take them in just a second. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and start loading them up in chat. But I thought I would just share some next steps. So I'm like, okay, well, that was a lot of information. What do I do now? So the very first thing you might do is just show your students some field guides. Again, even if you go to Amazon and just take screenshots of field guides and begin using the words explore and discover to describe what we do with words, because this is a huge shift in their thinking and in our thinking, and it's a shift that makes all the difference. Model a field guide entry. You don't have to spend 50 minutes doing it. You could spend a few minutes doing it, or you could spend 2 or 3 minutes working on a field guide in front of them over the course of a week. And at the end of the week, see how much you've been able to discover about your word and how many different directions you've been able to take it. Let students practice. After I model, then I let them do it either in small groups or in partners. They choose a word. Someone asked earlier, is it really helpful for them to start with a common word? Usually, I encourage them to start with a common word that they are curious about, just like I was curious about the word couch. And to do that with a group of 3 or 4 when we are not in COVID times and we can all gather around a piece of like chart paper and work together. It's really, really fun. Work on it with a partner. And then eventually, once they've had some group practice, okay, now you're ready to go out and do your very own first choice word field guide. And dole out those mini lessons in little doses. Okay, I spend about like those first 3 or 4 days that are on the little calendar that I gave you on the onboarding doc. I do those sequentially, where we look at real field guides, I model, they practice with a partner, a small group, and then they do it on their own. But after that, I'm doling out these mini lessons a little bit at a time. I'm like, okay, before you start today, let's just look together at some questions we might ask about our words. Or before we start today, let's look at what Google News could tell us about our words. And so that over time, those field guides are becoming better and deeper. As we move forward out of this webinar session, I'd also love for you to stay in touch and share your students' work with me. I would love to see the way that you and they are innovating on this work and how it's going. I am planning on offering a year-long PLC next year. So stay tuned, stay in touch to Moving Writers. That's where I will give any information. If this is something that you would really like to dig deep into with me over the next school year, focusing on lots of different types of field guide work, how you can pull it into the students' reading work, how you can pull it into their writing work. So be thinking about that. Be thinking about, okay, yeah, like this is something I would really like to dig into in a more serious way in a small group with me next year. All right, I'm going to take your questions. Here I go. Let's see, the first question we talked about, which was, do they need to start with a common word? I think it's helpful to really emphasize that element of discovery. This is not about, I mean, it can be about something you've never heard before, but it's more about a stance that we can make discoveries regardless of the word. We can make discoveries regardless of if it's a word we use every single day, right? There is so much to discover about language. And that's what excites us. And that's what excites the kids. Do you use this as a formative assessment? Personally, I like the idea of just exploring, but I do have some pressure about assessing. Yes, Kristen, I do. This is a homework grade for us. We do it largely in class as a warm-up. I've given it as homework, like your homework this week is to make a choice word field guide. It's due Monday. I've done that. This year, I'm doing it like the first 5 minutes of every class is working on your choice word field guide entry, and it's due at the end of the week. At the bottom of the instructions, there may not be. I don't remember which version of the instructions I gave you, but I have like the most low-key rubric ever. It's 3 columns. It's like a 100, an 80, or like a 60, whatever your grading scale is. But I call them a wow field guide, a meh field guide, like MEH, like meh, or a disappointing field guide. And I list those characteristics, like what to me looks like an excellent field guide, what to me is a meh field guide, and what to me is a really disappointing field guide. And I can quickly walk around the room. I can peek over their shoulders and give them that little quick baby homework grade in the grade book. So I do assess them. Yeah, I do. And I confer with students about them. And I tell them, like, take me into your field guide. Show me an interesting discovery you've made recently. This is among the things that I confer with students about. I do expect them to be using them in their writing. And so when we take the field guides and start applying them to their writing work, we do things with that. What other kinds of pages do you do other than free choice? So we also do root word field guides where we're studying a root together as a class and thinking about lots of words that come from that root. We also do a lot of field guides with their reading, find the most important word in this text, find the 3 most important words about this text, and what can you discover about those words? And for instance, we're doing this with Macbeth's dagger speech and his out brief candle speech this week in 8th grade, and small groups are condensing that speech down to just 3 words. And then they're giving those 3 words to another group. And that group is going to make a field guide entry about those 3 most essential words in the speech. And they're going to try to make discoveries, and they're going to then connect. Okay, so what did I discover that helps me understand Macbeth as a character in a new and different way? What is it adding to the characterization of Macbeth? We also do these in our writing. We think about making field guides of our most frequently used words, like those kind of ticks, right? Like that we always use in our writing, those words we use again and again and again. We think about our most important words, the critical words. We think about jargon and using words to increase the authority in our writing and unpacking those words and making discoveries about them. And this is one of the things I love most about field guide work, is that I am discovering and inventing new field guide entries every day because I just use it to meet the intentions of my teaching. And that's the wonderful thing about our role as English teachers, right? Is that vocabulary, words, are the great bridge between our reading instruction and our writing instruction. We are always dealing in words, but it's hard sometimes, oftentimes, to get kids to drill down to that word level of analysis. And field guides help us do that, whether it's in what we're reading or it's in what we're writing or whether it's in words we're just curious about. So I have a ton of different ways that I use this, but that also doesn't have to be prescriptive. And if you guys are interested, we can do future sessions on some of those other ways, but it's also an opportunity for you to say, like, okay, what is it I'm trying to teach my kids? Okay, how can we drill down to the word level and then use our field guides as a tool for unearthing more and more and more meaning? Yes, students will forever remember the words that they choose. It's so true. The learning is so sticky, this. And then a last question, do you ever give each student a word and then have them make a guide to teach others? Yes. And one of the ways that we assess this in addition to just like me sort of peeking and giving them some credit in the grade book, is I ask them to tell the story of their word. And telling the story of their word is more than just reading their field guide. It's like, okay, in the beginning, here's how I came to this word. And here's some of the tension and conflict and questions I developed along the way in the middle. And then the resolution is, ta-da, here's like the epiphany I had, or the new, deeper understanding. I have definitely assigned kids words in the past. I assigned small groups words to uncover, or we'll come up with a list together, like a small list, and students will choose from that. But the choice word field guide is the place to start, and it's the simplest place to start. And this is really the key to unlocking all of those other types of field guides, because once they know the routines and rhythms of exploring a word, and once they see what it feels like to make discoveries about words, then they're ready for all that other stuff. Then they're ready to explore words from their articles of the week and make meaning from it, and Macbeth and their own essays in class. So thank you so much for being with me tonight. I hope you can tell I love this stuff, and I'm so grateful for you spending the time to talk about it with me. If you try this, if you find yourself having more questions all of a sudden and you're like, wait, I don't know how to do this, please reach out. You can find me on Twitter, and you can find me at movingwriters@gmail.com. That's my email address. But I would love to hear from you. I would love to continue in this work with you side by side. And I hope that you have a wonderful night and a really peaceful end of this school year. I hope it's smooth sailing from here. Thank you so much for being here. Take care.